Hello and welcome everyone. We are excited you're here for our webinar, Are You FDA Ready? Key Requirements and Enforcement for Food Facilities today. This is the first of a four-part series we are running through the end of the year, so be on the lookout for future webinars. Next slide. I'm proud to introduce Fabiola Negron, Registrar Corp's Director of Food Safety, who will be leading this webinar. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Microbiology and graduate coursework in Food Science and Technology from the University of Puerto Rico. Since joining Registrar Corp in 2016, her and her team have reviewed and developed over 2,000 food safety plans across HACCP, food defense, FSVP, and more for FDA compliance. Throughout this webinar, feel free to write any questions in the Q&A box, and we've saved time at the end to answer them. We'll also follow up with a link to the recording so you can refer back to this presentation at any time. Without any further ado, Fabiola, take it away.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, viewers, for joining us today. I am thrilled to begin our food and beverage webinar series. And before we start, I'd like to remind our viewers who Registrar Corp is. I'm sure we have assisted some of you already with our many compliance services, and maybe we helped you register or write your food safety plan, helped you with the detention or reviewing your labels. But it's important to know that Registrar Corp is the global leader in FDA regulatory compliance, and we currently assist over 30,000 clients across 175 countries. We have 20 offices worldwide to provide support in your respective time zone and languages. We offer 27 services and software solutions to address your compliance needs, and we have a high level of client satisfaction in over the 20 years of experience, helping companies in the food, supplement, cosmetic, drug, and medical device industries. Our specialists really know their stuff, and we have the experience to help you navigate the complexities of the FDA requirements and help you achieve compliance. We are excited to share that we are also ISO 27001 certified, and this is to ensure that all your data and the information that you share with Registrar Corp is kept safe. So we hope that you continue to partner with us, and if you haven't yet, well, we hope that you choose us in the future. We are excited to start today with our webinar, and we are going to be talking about FDA registrations that are required, all about our food safety, the FDA food safety requirements. We're also going to touch upon labeling requirements for food and beverage and the prior notice requirements, and we'll end with how FDA enforces all those regulations. So first, we'll start with food facility registrations. These are required for all facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food and beverage, including dietary supplements. It applies to foods intended for humans or animals. And when registering your facility, you have to understand that you are letting the FDA know that you are producing foods that will be consumed in the United States. A registration has to be renewed every 2 even years. And this year, 2024, is a renewal year. So we'd like to remind you of that. Renewals must be completed by December 31st of this year. And any information in the FFR that changes before renewal time, you have to be sure that you're keeping it updated in the FDA FURL system. Information such as products that are processed at the facility can change throughout the year and over time, and it's important that you keep that information current for the FDA. Facilities that are outside of the United States must also designate a U.S. agent for FDA communications in order to complete the registration process. No U.S. agent means no registration. In registering, you are consenting the FDA to come to your facility and inspect you. So it's important that you're compliant with all the FDA regulations and FDA ready. Another requirement that is tied to your registration is to have a unique facility identifier. So far, the FDA has only approved the Duns and Bradstreet number, better known as DUNS, and this number is assigned after Duns and Bradstreets have verified that your facility is a legitimate business. There have been cases where non-existent locations have been registered with the FDA as a food facility, and this puts our consumers at risk when the origin of the food cannot be traced. So the DUNS is needed per facility location. It is location specific. So if you have multiple locations to register, each would need their specific DUNS number. It is simpler for facilities in the United States to obtain a DUNS, and it gets more complex in certain countries. It is not a quick process. It can take up to 45 days for a DUNS to be issued as they gather the information and do their verification. So it is important to know that Duns and Bradstreet is not part of the FDA. They are simply verifying that you have a legitimate business. So I want to clear out some misconceptions today about the FDA and what they approve. So we often see companies that state that they are FDA approved. And this information and the FDA's logo is up on their website or their labels, any marketing materials, or maybe even in their food safety documents, they are saying that they are FDA approved. But this is not allowed. It is prohibited to say that your food product or your facility is FDA approved. The FDA will take action when they see this practice, and being registered with the FDA does not make your facility or product FDA approved. What this says, as we mentioned before, is that you have notified the FDA of your intent to send products to the United States for, to be consumed by American citizens. And, you're letting them know that you're allowing them to come and inspect you to make sure that you're complying with the FDA regulations. Another thing that the FDA does not do is that they do not issue certificates of registration or certificates of approval. So once you register, us as a third-party company, if we have helped you register, we'll issue a certificate that serves as evidence that you were registered with FDA, and we provide your FDA registration number and your information because it makes the process of demonstrating that you are registered easier, and you can share that with your buyers, with customs brokers. It provides the information in a simpler way. But the FDA does not give or issue a certificate of registration. It's important to know that difference. And like I mentioned before, using the logo for sales or marketing purposes in food safety documents and or labels is prohibited. And, they can issue action against you if you do that. So please be aware, understand, check your websites, check your labels, check your documents to make sure that you're not making this mistake. So another misconception about approvals is that, the FDA approved my food or they approved my facility. So the FDA, the only thing that they actually approve are food additives and color additives. However, that doesn't mean they approve your particular food additive or color additive. They have these additives listed in the Code of Federal Regulations that are known as the CFR, and they will have a list of additives that they've approved for use in food. But that doesn't mean that your specific additive that you produce has been FDA approved. You are producing an approved additive under the regulations, but your product is not specifically approved. So just as a reminder, food ingredients, food facilities, your processes, dietary supplements, medical foods, infant formula, food labels or nutrition facts, structure function claims in those labels, FDA does not approve that for you. So you have to make sure that you are not making any claims in that your product is FDA approved. So let's rehash what we already said. We first need a food facility registration or FFR, and that is our general FDA registration, we have registered our facility. However, if you also if you produce shelf-stable foods in hermetically sealed containers, then you also have to register it as a food canning establishment or an FCE. So these are the characteristics of what a low acid canned food is or an acidified food is. There's specific pH and water activity requirements that would make your products fall into these categories. So food facilities that process these foods need a FCE in addition to that FFR. And let's remember that the FFR also requires a DUNS number. So when you're registering and you also fall under an FCE requirement, then you must have your FFR, your FCE, and the DUNS number. These three registrations or submissions are linked. So if there is wrong information or different information or an error has been made in any of these three submissions, that can impact your registration going through successfully with the FDA. So it is important that when you register your facility under FFR, the same information, the same name, the same address is used in the FCE registration and also is matching the DUNS number. We've seen many cases of registrations not going through or being suspended because there was an error in this information. In addition to registering, because these are high-risk foods, the FDA also requires FCE manufacturers to submit their process filings with FDA. This is a submission of their scheduled process. And the FDA will assign an SID number for each individual product type that is manufactured under FCE. So that means that products with, let's say you have a low acid canned food and you have a can of peaches, a particular packaging type, let's say it's in an aluminum can, and then you also have a pouch. Those would require two different submissions and they will require different SID numbers. So it's important that you identify the type of food. If any of your products fall under LACF or AF foods, then you must be registered with FCE and submit the proper information to receive an SID. And this SID will be required at entry of the product. So if you're exporting from your country into the United States, then you will need to submit that SID number at the time that your product is entering the United States. If you don't have one, that will result in a detention at the port. So this is just an example of typical products that might be subject to FCE, but let's remember that they need to meet the criteria in the previous slide for pH and water activity. But as you see, typical products could be are shelf stable and hermetically sealed, and they could be packaged in pouches, cans, carton, and glass. So there are certain exemptions from a food facility registration. Facility registrations are from facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods for human or animal consumption. And this only applies to the facilities that come into direct physical contact with the food. So sales or headquarter offices and trading companies are exempt from registration. Also, personal residences are exempt. Transportation companies, farms, retail food establishments, fishing vessels that do not engage in processing on board that vessel, and also facilities that are entirely regulated by the USDA. So these would not require an FDA registration. Now we'll move forward to the food safety requirements. So who needs to comply with US FDA food safety regulations? So the foods that are subjects to this regulation are food and beverages for human and animals. And it includes ingredients and additives, processed foods, seafood, fresh produce, dietary supplements, meat, which is not subject to the USDA. So as we remember, meat, poultry, and eggs subject to FDA are only under FDA, USDA jurisdiction, but these other types of meats like wild turkey, bison, deer, rabbit, and some others will fall under FDA requirements. So when producing foods for the US market, you must ensure they are processed in compliance with the applicable food safety regulations, and there are quite a few to consider. The safety of both human and animal foods sold or distributed in the interstate commerce, which includes imported food, would fall under FDA's jurisdiction. This applies to both domestic and foreign facilities. The requirement will vary per type of food or process. However, the domestic and foreign requirements are exactly the same. So whatever is required of the US food manufacturers is the same as any foreign food manufacturer. Also, farms are subject to US FDA regulations for covered produce. So there are specific requirements for produce safety as well. So excluded, as we've said before, foods that are subject solely to the USDA will be exempt from FDA food safety requirements, and also alcoholic beverages because they fall under different jurisdiction with TTB. So the US food safety regulations under FDA are found in Title 21 of the CFR. And the CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. Here we will highlight some of the regulations to show you where you can find some of the most important requirements, but it's important to know that this list is not all inclusive. There are more requirements under Title 21 that you need to be aware of. But you must do very thorough research or hire us to do it for you so you can rest assured that you have identified the right requirements and that you have covered all your bases when it comes to your specific product and operation. So here we see that, juice, seafood, LACF products, acidified foods, infant formula, dietary supplements, bottled water have specific requirements under the 21 CFR. And there are other products or ingredients and additives and color additives that also have different requirements. So you must go into the regulation to see what can apply to your particular product. So other regulations that are under also FDA and are related to food safety came about with FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act. And these brought forth more requirements and included other persons in the supply chain besides food facilities to also have food safety requirements in place. So preventive controls for human or animal foods came about, produce safety for covered produce farms, and the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which applies to importers, intentional adulteration rule, which includes requirements for food defense, then also requirements for transport vehicles that are transporting food in the United States must also comply with certain sanitary transportation requirements. And now, the latest rule to be enforced soon is food traceability. So it's important that you are aware of all these regulations that may apply and that you are prepared before sending your products to the United States and being inspected by the FDA. So here we just wanted to share with you a simple diagram because it can give you case or to your particular product or operation. So as we mentioned, thorough research of the regulations must be done to ensure that you have implemented all of the applicable food safety requirements, and some foods can be covered by a combination of regulations. So as we saw in the previous tables, there may be regulations for a specific type of food, and these are typically known as CGMPs for dietary supplements, or CGMPs for low acid canned foods, or CGMPs for infant formula. So in the case of low acid canned foods, as an example, let's give canned tuna. So canned tuna would be subject to seafood HACCP because of the fish, but because it is a low acid canned food, it will also require compliance with the low acid canned foods regulation. So depending on the parameters of your food, it might be subject to one or more regulations in the CFR. Infant formula is also another example. It must follow its own specific GMPs, but also subject to the preventive controls for human food. So they are required to have a food safety plan as well. So here we see that we have the base of any food is going to be subject to CGMPs. So CGMPs are general practices for the safety of the food that are routinely executed at any processing plant. So you have your proper equipment, you check the quality of the water being used, that the building and its surroundings are conducive to a safe environment for food production, that you are preventing contamination in every step of the way. And these are all covered in the GMPs. And different requirements of GMPs, as we said, will apply to different types of foods in some instances. But that's the general idea, that you have basic foundational processes or procedures to ensure the safety of the food. And then you go into the more detailed requirements that could be the food safety plans, the supply chain program, recall plans, or food defense plans. So depending on the type of operation, you can be subject to multiple of these requirements. And you see that there are differences in the types of plans that are required by the FDA. Now, it's important to know that in industry, it's a regular practice to have a HACCP plan, and HACCP is a globally recognized system in order to ensure the safety of foods. But somebody who does dietary supplements is not required by the FDA to have a HACCP plan in place. They have uh, their own CGMPs, and they have their quality control procedures, and they are required to have quality control steps, and they are required to have a master manufacturing record which lists all their steps and critical steps that require controls to ensure that the dietary supplements meet specifications, for example. So it's not saying you need a written HACCP plan, it's delineating other type of requirements that are similar to what we could also do in a HACCP plan. So it's very normal in industry to say, I have a HACCP plan for my product, it's a dietary supplement, but the FDA will not require you to have one. Now, different from other human foods, then they will require a food safety plan, a supply chain program, a recall plan, a food defense plan. So the requirements vary, and it's important to know what is industry practice versus what is FDA required. But having a HACCP plan for dietary supplements is good. It's great that you go and take that extra step. That's not a bad thing, but FDA won't require you to have it. Now, there are certain exemptions from these plans or programs that we mentioned. So these plans or programs do not apply to retail establishments. Retail establishments fall mostly under state regulations, so the FDA won't require them to have plans or programs in place. Alcoholic beverages are subject to TTB, so they are not required to have these plans or programs. Also, USDA regulated products. Farms are not required to have a plan, even though there's some of them might be subject to produce safety requirements. That rule does not require having a written plan. And also warehouses. If you're storing finished products that are packaged and you're not engaging in manufacturing or processing, you're not going to require a plan, as you're not controlling any hazards. Now, does that mean that I can't have a plan in place? No. As we mentioned, if you want to have a plan and ensure that pest control is done well, that you have proper controls in place for, let's say, allergen cross contact. There are many different things that you can monitor through a HACCP plan, but FDA is not going to require you to have one in those particular cases. Then we have, on the other hand, modified requirements. So this means that you are subject to a particular regulation, but because you meet certain criteria, the FDA can allow you certain different requirements under these rules. So we won't go into detail about all of them today because in a subsequent webinar, we will discuss what are qualified facilities and very small business. But basically, based on your financial criteria, you can benefit from certain exemptions. So qualified facilities are not required to have a food safety plan and supply chain program. And in the case of very small businesses under intentional adulteration rule or food defense, if you're a very small business, you will not be required to have a food defense plan in place. So we will go into more detail later on in other webinars, but that's just to give you an idea to start looking up your financial information and, check with the regulations to ensure that if you are eligible for an exemption, you take advantage of it. Now we're moving on into food labeling requirements. And the food label requirements are found in 21 CFR 101. So 21 CFR 101. And the FDA has set requirements for where information needs to be placed on the product labels. They have the required information for the different sides of the packaging, specifications for the units of measured used in the, or declared in the packaging. And they also have requirements for how ingredients and additives must be listed. So we will go over the list of the mandatory label declarations. So the statement of identity, this is the common name of the food. So if I am manufacturing cookies, or something like an Oreo, the standard of identity of that, I believe, is a chocolate sandwich cookie. So, it's very direct, it's very specific, and the consumer will know exactly what they are buying. Then the net quantity statement is the amount of the product. And like I said, the FDA has specifications for the units of measure to be used, if it's liquid, if it's a solid. So it's important to understand the specifications for that and for calculating and adding the right numbers. Then the ingredient list is the listing of each ingredient in order of predominance. So the ingredient added in largest quantity will be first, going down to the least quantity. The FDA also requires an allergen statement if your food contains one of the major allergens identified by the FDA. So we understand that there are different requirements based on the different countries. So it's important that you are not listing allergens that are not on FDA's list because that will get you in trouble. Sometimes we might think, oh, what's the harm? I can add celery in there as an allergen. Like, what's the harm? Well, FDA will detain the product and will say it's misbranded because that is not a major allergen in the United States. So sometimes we might think, oh, it's going to be good. But no, please keep in mind that this is the list: milk, soy, wheat, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, crustaceans, shellfish, and sesame. Those are the 9 major allergens identified by the FDA. And also, they require the identity of the manufacturer, distributor, or packer to be identified on the product label. And this is for FDA to reach out in case of an emergency, that consumer can find, who is responsible for the product to make a claim or have a customer complaint. So it's important that that information is also there. The country of origin is where the food originated from for FDA and custom border protection purposes. So it's important that you understand those requirements as well, as there can be different ways of declaring the country of origin depending on what type of activities were done in the different countries. So it's important that you are aware of that. Also, additional languages, and this is very common in Europe. There might be three, four, five different languages on a label, and the FDA requires all the mandatory information to be in all the different languages that you choose to put on your label. So if you choose, let's say you choose just Spanish and English, let's make it simple. You choose Spanish and English, all the mandatory information needs to be in both languages. You can't choose some information in English and then all of the labels in Spanish or vice versa. All of the mandatory information must be in both languages. So imagine if having three, four, five different languages, that is a lot of space that you're going to need. So be mindful that when sending product to the United States, English is there, and that if you choose to do more than one language, you're going to have to make space for all of the mandatory information in those different languages. Then you have the nutrition facts panel, unless there's an exemption. There are certain exemptions, but the nutrition facts panel will include nutritional information about the food per serving and the content of calories, fat, carbohydrates, proteins. Those are also mandatory information, and the requirement may vary depending on the different types of foods. So there are foods that could be exempt from having nutrition facts panel. So here we just wanted to show you some examples of different nutrition fact label formats that are allowed by the FDA. So it just depends on the size of your product and on other different parameters. But the FDA is very particular about the serving size, the font type, the font size, and other details. So this is to ensure that us as consumers can have the information that we need consistently in every product that we find in the market. Like I mentioned, there are certain foods that might be exempt from having a nutrition facts label, such as fresh fruits and vegetables. That's one of examples. And also other products with insignificant amount of nutrients in them, such as coffee, tea, or spices, could also be exempt. Now we're moving on to FDA prior notice. And prior notice came about with the Bioterrorism Act. So this is a way that the FDA and Customs Border Protection is protecting the US consumers from terrorism or attacks on our food supply. So the FDA requires a notification of any shipments of food for humans or animals that are imported into the United States. And this is required for most imported foods that are imported for commercial purposes. And please be aware that it includes samples. So when you're sending samples to a trade show or you are sending samples to be distributed to the general public, you have to notify the FDA that that product is coming into the country. It is very important that you're aware of that, and that even if you choose to bring that as part of your baggage, because it's for commercial purposes, you have to let the FDA know. So detentions can happen at the port when prior notice is not given to the FDA that these products are coming, and it includes information about the shipment and the facility that produced that product. The prior notice can be filed by different parts in the supply chain, like the exporter, the importer, or a third party through the ACS of the CBP system or the FDA prior notice system. And there are certain exemptions. So if I am bringing product for my personal use from another country, I do not have to give prior notice. If I am, let's say I'm located in a foreign country, I am in Italy, and I prepared some food and I sent it to my family in the United States, that does not require prior notice because I prepared the food. I am sending that for a personal purpose. It's not a commercial purpose. Also, foods that are subject to USDA jurisdiction do not need to submit prior notice to the FDA. Products in diplomatic bags or pouches, and products exported without leaving the port of arrival until export are also not required prior notice. So there are different requirements for when you have to submit prior notice. I cannot submit prior notice 5 months in advance. So there are certain limitations so that the FDA can receive the information in a timely manner. So for transporting trucks, 2 hours before the shipment's arrival by road, 4 hours before shipment's arrival by rail, 4 hours before the shipment's arrival by air, 8 hours if it comes by water, and before the food is shipped by international mail. So you do not submit more than 15 calendar days before the anticipated day of arrival. So you have to make sure that you're submitting prior notice with ample time, within the parameters that FDA has established. Let's move on to FDA enforcement of their regulations. So the FDA mainly enforces their regulation through inspections, and they can inspect importers, they can inspect the food facilities, and they can inspect the product at the port of entry. So with importer inspections, as we mentioned, this came about with the FSMA rules, and now importers are required to verify their suppliers to ensure they are complying with the food safety regulations. This inspection entails a records review by the FDA. So they will check your verification program, and they will check that you have approved your suppliers, that you have conducted proper verification activities to make sure that the food that you're importing is safe. And it gives the FDA a window into the foreign supplier's compliance status. So before, the FDA had to visit the facilities in order to know if they were compliant with the regulations, but now they have two ways of doing that. They could go to your importer, check their records, and if you're not compliant and they're not compliant, then both of you can get in trouble. So it's important that importers are compliant and that they are only approving compliant suppliers, as the FDA can, peek into your facility through that record verification. And the importer inspections can be either on-site or done remotely. So they have more capacity then to inspect importers because of that flexibility. Then we move on to food facility inspections, which can only be done on site. This doesn't mean that the FDA cannot request documents from a supplier. If they are undergoing an investigation for a recall, or there is any cause for them to verify your compliance in more detail. However, facility inspections are done on site because they require a walkthrough of the facility. So the inspector will be observing the operations, they will be observing the adequacy and cleanliness of your equipment, that you are following good manufacturing practices, as we mentioned, and that you have proper control measures at the different steps of your process to ensure the safety of your food. It also requires a records review. So in addition of observing the facility and the employees, their practices, they are going to request your food safety plan. They might request your food defense plan. They will request your supply chain program, or in the case of dietary supplements, your master manufacturing record. Give me your food defense plan. So they will verify the applicable food safety records required under the regulations. Foreign facilities get about a 3-month advance notice of FDA inspections, but this is only because the FDA has to arrange travel. So they're not just going to pop up at your facility. They're going to send you a notification. They're going to send you a form with a questionnaire, and they're going to ask you several questions to confirm your location, to please provide your operating hours and your product types. So they are preparing to conduct that inspection. And then they have a travel coordinator that will also, coordinate their flights. They will ask you if you could recommend a hotel nearby, what is the best mode of transport to reach your facility. So they will request that as a recommendation so that they can, reach your facility safely. But that's why they get a 3-month advance notice. Domestic inspections, however, they just knock on your door and they're there. It's easy to verify that the location, and also they arrange the travel. Like I mentioned before, there were instances in which facilities were being registered that did not exist. So the FDA could not take that chance of, using the resources to go to a location and the location, there's no facility at the location. So it's important to understand that difference. And for product sampling at the port of entry, they conduct routine sampling. Less than 2% of the food at the port is actually inspected because there is a lot of product coming in and we need that to reach the consumers. But the FDA is trying, their hardest to make sure that we have preventive food safety practices so that the supply chain is producing safe foods. So they sample for contaminants, for pathogens, for pesticide residues, heavy metals, other chemical contaminants, other biological contaminants. They can check the labels for compliance, that allergens are properly declared, that there's no fraud or misbranding, misrepresentations of the product. They will also check FCE has been submitted properly. So those things all can be checked at the port of entry. Now, what happens when the FDA finds you to be not compliant with the regulations? They can take different courses of action depending on the severity of the issue. But typically, if during an inspection they find observations, the first step is to issue a 483. And a 483 is just the list of observations or issues found during the inspection. And they will give you a period of time, typically 15 days, to respond to that 483 with your corrective actions. Now, if 15 days have passed and you're like, well, the FDA hasn't said anything yet, well, you just sit and wait, because if you don't respond or you respond and your corrective actions are not adequate, the FDA can follow up with a warning letter. And a warning letter is a more serious action and is issued, like we mentioned, when you either don't respond or when a hazard is or an observation is significant enough, they can issue a warning letter as well. With repeated violations, a warning letter is also sometimes issued. Another course of action could be to request you to recall a product. So there are two types of recalls. There can be a voluntary recall or a mandatory recall. So if the FDA inspected your facility, let's say they found listeria in your products and you had some of that product already distributed in the market, the course of action is to conduct a voluntary recall. But if you refuse, and we know that that product has been distributed to the market, the FDA will issue a mandatory recall. So it's important that, when the FDA does these findings, we cooperate and we do what's in the best interest of the consumer's safety. Next, there could be refusals at the port of entry. So the FDA can refuse a product that is found in violation of the requirements. If it's adulterated, if it's misbranded, they will also allow time, if the issue is fixable, for you to submit your corrective actions and change. For example, with labels, it's simple, in quotes, to relabel a product. Sometimes that's totally fixable. But let's say your canned food was found to have Clostridium botulinum. Well, that is not fixable. The FDA will refuse it and ask you to destroy that product. So it's important that what you're sending to the United States, you have done your due diligence, you make sure that you have followed the FDA procedures, that you have validated processes, that you have all your T's crossed and I's dotted to make sure that you are preventing detentions at the port and, most importantly, protecting the consumers. Next, we have import alerts, and import alerts are detentions without physical examination. So if we go back a step, we see that import refusals can be issued by the FDA. They detain your product, they find something wrong with it, they can refuse that shipment. Now, if you have repeated violations or there are significant violations that the FDA has decided to then take the step to put you on an import alert red list, then all the shipments that you send for that product in the future will be automatically detained and they're not going to be examined. So let's say, for example, a big known example is salmonella in black pepper. So let's say that I sent a shipment last month and it was detained, and then 3 weeks ago another shipment was detained. It's likely that FDA will place me on the import alert because I continue to import products that are adulterated with salmonella. So once I'm on that import alert, the FDA will no longer detain and examine my product for salmonella. They will just detain it and tell me, okay, it's going to be refused. So unless you provide evidence that that product was tested and it was free of salmonella, the FDA will not release it. So each time that you continue to import the salmonella, you will have to show the evidence, show the testing, and this can be very costly. So it's important that you prevent that type of action to be placed on import alert whenever possible. But if you are on the list, you can later submit a petition to be removed from that green list. With import alerts, it's important to also know that there are two types. So the red type, a red list, is the bad list. If you're on that list, your product will be detained and refused. And then there's a green list where there is maybe a countrywide or a product-wide import alert. And instead of placing all the companies in that country under import alert for that product, the FDA will only list the ones that are good to be released. So it's the opposite. So if I'm on the green list for, I believe there's one for papaya from Mexico, if I am not mistaken. So if you're on that green list, that means you can ship your papayas to the United States without issue. But if you're not on that green list, the FDA will detain each shipment and you will have to demonstrate that it's safe, and it is, a very complex process. Other significant, actions that the FDA can take, they can suspend your registration. And that means that you cannot import any food into the United States because, as we said, an FFR or the registration is the key into bringing your product into the United States or distributing your product within the United States. So if you're not FDA registered, you cannot distribute your products in the United States. Another action that can escalate, we have the example of Peanut Corporation of America. This is a big example. They were distributing peanut butter with salmonella, and they knew that it contained salmonella. The quality lab had made the testing, they had found salmonella, and they decided to knowingly distribute that product to the American consumers. So, people died, they got sick, and in this case, the situation escalated into the owner of that company serving jail time, as well as the person in charge of quality control, because they were knowingly distributing that product. So it's important to know that the FDA has, relationships with the different governments in around the world. They have procedures in place to handle those situations domestically as well as internationally. So it's important that you are aware that the FDA does not only issue paperwork. They're not issuing you just a letter and getting you off with a warning. There are cases that if the situation merits, it could escalate into civil and criminal charges. And not to mention that all of this information, if you are detained, if you have an import refusal, if you have an import alert, if you were issued a 483 or a warning letter, this is all public information on the FDA website. So I could go search your company name and I see your FDA compliance history right on the internet. It's public for anybody to access and see. So if you continuously get FDA actions issued to you, that can have a huge impact in your business and your reputation. So you want to make sure that if you are in trouble, you're working to get out of that trouble with the FDA and try to salvage your reputation. But if you haven't been in trouble yet, take any action to prevent being on the FDA website with regulatory actions under your company name. Um, if you're exporting from foreign countries into the United States, or even if you're distributing within here, you don't want your buyers to see, oh, X and Y company has import refusals, or they have been issued a warning letter because their practices were not conducive of proper food safety practices. That is very difficult to then try to gain the confidence of your buyers again. So we can definitely help you be compliant and stay compliant and help you prevent those issues. So how can we help? We have a team of regulatory specialists that work with FDA regulations day in and day out. We have our labeling department, we have our food safety department, and we work tirelessly to make sure that we are thorough, that we are detail oriented, that we provide you with plans, programs, or labels that are compliant with the regulations. We also do our research to make sure that we're providing you with the most updated FDA requirements and to offer the solutions to the problems that you may encounter if you're responding to 483s or a warning letter. We help with corrective actions. We can help write food safety plans and supply chain programs and FSVPs and recall plans. And we guide you through the process. So we're not just giving you the finished document. We also provide consulting along the way and answer any questions that you might have about the regulations and food processing. We also provide detention assistance. We help you register with the FDA. And if you are a foreign facility, we also can serve as your US agent. So we have over 20 years of experience in these requirements, and we know all the ins and outs, the quirkiness of the process. There are some tips and tricks that you learn along the way. So we do our best to make sure that the process is as smooth as possible for you, and that we have properly advised you so that you feel supported and confident in your procedures and in your business. So the attendees for this webinar are going to receive a discount good through November 13th of this year. And you are going to be eligible to get $200 off the food facility registration, $200 off food safety and label services, and $100 off of check reports for both food safety and labels. So it's important that you take the opportunity to benefit from those discounts as soon as possible. And please mark your calendars because this is a webinar series, as my friend Sophie mentioned at the beginning. So next will be on October 17th. We are going to be talking about the blueprint for FDA food safety, essential plans and programs. And it will be an in-depth webinar series to help you understand the FDA food facility requirements of the plans and programs that we mentioned today. And this section will focus on food safety plans, supply chain program, recall plans, HACCP plans, and food defense plans. So we will provide you the basic information that you need to check on your documents and make sure that you have all your bases covered. Now, when we're done, we will send you a 5-question survey. We highly encourage you to complete it because it will help us to continue improving these webinars and providing you the content that is relevant and important to you. So we want to make sure that we're giving you information that will help you throughout your food safety or FDA needs. Now we have reached our question and answer section. Give me a moment while I search your questions. Okay, so Rene Morales is asking if a company purchases a batch of products abroad that are not made for the USA and exports them to the USA on their own account without the manufacturer's consent, it is likely that the products will be detained and an import refusal will occur because the labeling was not made for the USA. Who will be marked as the company subject to the import refusal? That is an excellent question, Renee. And you are absolutely right. The FDA will send the enforcement action to the foreign manufacturer. So even if I did not manufacture the product and I decided to send it to the United States when it wasn't meant for the US market, the manufacturer of that product will receive the FDA action. So it is a little unfair, but it is very important that you understand where your product is going. And it is very hard to control because if you sold it to another company, whatever they did, you have really no control over that. But it's important that you then, maybe through your agreements or on the label, that you mark that this is only for Mexico, or this is only for Argentina, or this is only to be sold in the European Union, just to make sure that your customers are not putting you at risk of FDA enforcement action because your products are being distributed in the United States without your consent. And then it says the manufacturer or the company that attempted the import. Yeah, so it's for the manufacturer. So when we talked about prior notice and giving the FDA prior notice, you have to put the name of the manufacturer of the food. So whoever is conducting that import activity will then have to list, Rene Morales was the manufacturer of this food. So even though they are the ones importing it and not you, they still have to list and provide the food facility registration information for your manufacturing facility. So yes, it's important that we are aware. That was an excellent question. Okay. So this one is by Roberto Gallegos, and he asks, we are U.S. Customs brokers at the Mexico border and have a warehouse where we receive imports from Mexico. Do we need to comply with 21 CFR Subpart O of sanitary transportation? Please note we do not do the import trucking. We do not own trucks. We just receive the goods at the warehouse. No, so this is only for the vehicles that are transporting the food. So you may not be eligible or required to meet the sanitary transportation requirements. Dr. Sai Krishna Patty asks, is it mandatory to follow the labeling requirements for bulk packages intended for B2B sales? No, the labeling requirements are for retail. So what the consumers are receiving, bulk packaging has, certain information that needs to be on the packaging, but it does not require nutrition facts and all that other information that we mentioned today. Let me see. I appreciate your patience as I go through the questions. As a reminder, we will be sharing the presentation with all the persons that registered. So yes, we will be sending that after the webinar is over. Natasia Mailovani asks, where can I find the regulations for honey products? So honey products do not have specific regulations. Honey would require to be under the preventive controls rule. So that's 21 CFR 117. And you will need a food safety plan and a food defense plan, depending on your financial criteria, but it is subject to the preventive controls for human food. Monica Denisiuk is asking, when importing product to the US with little amount of processed food, less than 2% per portion, do we do under FDA or USDA supervision? So if the food contains meat, poultry, or egg products, above 2% or 2.5%, then it will fall under USDA. But if the food is just in general processed food, it will still fall under FDA. So it just depends whether it has meat, poultry, or egg product under USDA. Okay, so Natasia Mailovani also asked, if my company has ISO 22000 certificate, which include the HACCP plan, is that considered as food safety plans? So that depends, because the name of the document doesn't matter. What matters is that you have identified the hazards and the control measures that apply to your product to ensure its safety. So we would have to review the contents of your HACCP plan to see if it could be equivalent to the food safety plan requirements under preventive controls. And now that you bring up the certification, it's important to know that sometimes being ISO certified or BRC certified or SQF certified does not guarantee that you're in compliance with the FDA regulations. Unless they have a specific module within that audit that says we are checking FDA compliance, you have to be aware that there might be gaps in your program because you might be compliant with the certification parameters, but you're not necessarily compliant with the FDA. They are not equivalent. So it's important to, if you'd like us to review, we can review your HACCP plans or your food safety plans to give you a free assessment. And we just list general gaps to let you know if you needed to make changes? That's a great question as well. Mm. Okay, Christian is asking, I am the manufacturer of a product and sell it to a customer in France, for example. The customer exports it to the USA, for which the item was not produced. Who is responsible for deviations? So, yes, this is in line with that first question. The FDA will go against the manufacturer. So if you manufactured a product and it was shipped by somebody else unbeknownst to you to the United States, the FDA will issue its enforcement action or import refusal and list the manufacturer's name. So yes, it's important, like I mentioned, to check in your agreements to make sure that the food is not distributed anywhere else besides the countries that you intend the product to be distributed to. And Rinaldi asks, are we compliant if we have a CGMP certificate? This is in line with that ISO 22000 question, not necessarily. So it just depends like what that GMP certification is looking for, because HACCP, for example, is a globally recognized system, but FDA HACCP is not the same as a HACCP certification, so it's different. So unless you're getting a certification specific to FDA regulations, then that certification might not ensure that you are compliant with the FDA requirements. So Chintaka Bandara is asking, we are exporting pickled gherkins to manufacturers, but it is not recommended for direct consumption. Do we need FDA registration to export gherkins to the US? Yes. So if you're exporting raw materials or ingredients that are meant for food processing, for further processing, you would still need to register with the FDA, and you would still need to submit prior notice, and your importers are going to be required to either have a supply chain program or FSBP in place. So yes, any foods or raw ingredients, materials that are meant for human or animal consumption must be registered with the FDA. Okay. I will see if I can find at least two more questions. So I see some questions for specific product types. So one thing to understand about the FDA is that not every product category is going to have their own set of regulations. Like I mentioned, there's dietary supplements, infant formula, bottled water. So those are seafood and 100% juice. Those are the products that have their specific regulations, like low acid canned foods, acidified foods. But let's say for the honey question, moringa, I see that question for moringa now. There's no specific regulation for those products. So if your product does not fall under the other categories that I mentioned, then it's going to be subject most likely to the preventive controls for human food regulations. So 21 CFR 117. Then if any of you are manufacturing products for animals, then it would be 21 CFR 507, 507. That is the one for animal foods. Do we have an office in India? Yes, we do. We do have an office in India. see. Leslie Elston says, I'm already FDA compliant. How can your company assist me? Well, we can assist you by doing that general gap assessment that I mentioned. We can do it it's a free initial courtesy review just to get a lay of the land, to just give you general observations if we find any. So just having that extra step of assurance, doesn't cost you anything. But if we do find something, then we'll tell you how we can, if you can benefit from a food safety plan, or you can have a label review, for example, under our label services. So it just depends. But there's no harm in getting in contact with us and sending us your information, and we can go from there. Okay. Okay, so Carol LaRue says, if you can't say you are FDA registered or approved facility, how does a company communicate about being in compliance with the requirements? So you cannot say that you're FDA approved. It's definitely appropriate to say we are FDA registered. That is a true statement. That is a fact. But being registered does not mean you are approved. That's the difference. So you cannot say, my honey products are FDA approved, because the FDA does not approve honey products. They don't do that type of approval. Now you can say my honey facility is FDA registered. That is a very different statement, and it's allowed. Let's see, I'm looking for one last question. So Jude Sharp, she asked, when is preventive controls required versus a HACCP plan? So HACCP is only required for juice and seafood. So if you produce 100% juice, then you would be subject to juice HACCP. And if you are producing fish or fishery products, then you would be subject to the seafood HACCP plan. Any other products would then fall under preventive controls unless they are dietary supplements. Dietary supplements have their own requirement, but anything else would fall under preventive controls for human food, requiring a food safety plan. Great question. So I think we are good to go. I hope that you enjoyed our webinar and that you found it helpful. Please remember to fill out that survey at the end so that we make sure that we are giving you the information that you want to hear about and that is useful to you. Any questions that were not answered at the webinar, we can reach out to you with those answers and we will happily assist you. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.